May 1945, in the soft light of a North German evening, the war was ending with the sound of typewriter keys. A tall civilian economist with a bookish calm, John Kenneth Galbraith, sat across from a prisoner who had kept the German war machine alive for 3 ruinous years. The prisoner's name was Albert Speer. He was not here for melodrama. He was here for arithmetic. U.S. officers laid out folders whose weight had nothing to do with paper. There were graphs that rose like cliffs, factory floor photographs stitched into panoramas, a canister of film that smelled faintly of acetate and cold metal. Across one page, there was a single typewritten line, so simple it looked almost harmless. 96,318. That was the number of U.S. military aircraft produced in 1944, an output higher than the Luftwaffe could shoot down, higher than German plants could ever replace, and high enough to fill the sky no matter how bravely a pilot climbed. Speer read the number, and the room got smaller. He had seen numbers before. In 1942, he learned to make columns march. More shifts, more dispersal, more pressure, more fear. He had held up tables like shields and called it an armaments miracle. But the film projector hummed to life, and there, flickering in monochrome, was a line that moved like a living thing. Rivet guns chattered, sub-assemblies slid. Fuselages rolled past as if the building itself were a river. On screen, a Liberator bomber left a factory floor almost every hour, a pace so steady it looked rehearsed. Ford's wartime promotional film even boasted of one bomber every 55 minutes. Whether 63 or 55, the larger point was clear. This was an industrial beat the Reich could not match. Galbraith did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He had the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey behind him and a simple brief: show, don't tell. Paul Nitze, the hard-edged strategist who had helped rush this prisoner into the interview room before other Allied claims could scatter him to a dozen jurisdictions, sat with a pen poised like a metronome. Speer was asked to describe the bottlenecks that haunted him: coal trains, canal barges, ball bearings, hydrogenation plants. He answered with the engineer's reflex: precise, clipped, confident. Then Nitze changed the page, and the conversation pivoted from Germany's inward struggles to America's outward reach. How many machines, how fast, and for how long? The camera cut. Your editor can make this a match cut, from the projector's luminous frame to the glare of a factory floor. Rhythm mattered more than size, because rhythm was what killed the contest. When a line stabilized above a certain rate, the war of attrition turned into a war of drowning. Workers stepped into their places the way aircrew stepped into cockpits. Conveyors paused for seconds, not hours. One bomber an hour sounded like a boast. In film, paired with pallets in motion and dolly shots gliding past racks of control surfaces, it became something colder, a timer that the axis could not stop. We bring Speer back into frame not to soften him, but to center the drama where it belonged, on the meeting between a political criminal and the curve that condemned his project. He was a polished man, architect's posture, careful diction, who had once stood within the echo of Hitler's voice. He also presided over a system that enslaved and killed. The camera must not forget that. A quick voiceover notes the Nuremberg judgment and the 20-year sentence that would follow. Then the narration returns to the table, to the documents, to the hum that never rose above a whisper. The most devastating lines in the war were not on maps. They were on charts. Germany's armaments effort grew most in darkness, dispersed to forests, burrowed into hills, split into 1,000 small shops to dodge daylight and bombs. America's grew in light, vast halls with glass high on the walls, roof trusses like cathedral ribs, lines long enough to seem like tricks of perspective. Dispersal cost efficiency. Every truck detour, every lost jig, every air raid pause turned minutes into squandered mornings. The Americans, building under intact skies and intact railroads, did more with fewer interruptions. The visual math was unforgiving. Give the audience one number, then give it a body. 96,000 aircraft in 1944 became 263 planes a day, or roughly one every 5.5 minutes around the clock. Pair that with a map montage of training fields, depots, and forward air bases. Then ask a plain question. If you lose a fighter, how quickly can you replace it? Plane, pilot, oil, and parts. The answer was what Speer could not unsee on Galbraith's pages. The United States had built a machine to outlast mistakes and absorb losses. You do not beat a factory like that by managing harder. You beat it by living in a different world. Germany did not. The film in the projector spooled to another hall, the low, patient power of sub-assembly feeds. Center sections, nacelles, wing panels, cradled like sleeping whales, moved between fixtures with a grace that looked accidental until you noticed the colored tags, the chalk marks, the hand signals that turned noise into choreography. You could tell the line was healthy because it looked boring. Workers repeated, inspected, repeated, adjusted. Quality grew in quiet. Contrast that with the stressed German plants where inspectors hunted cracks with flashlights while the roof still smoked. The audience didn't need an engineer's lecture. They needed 3 or 4 sensory specifics that anchored the abstract. Smell of cutting fluid, the pale spray of coolant, the printed torque charts taped above a bench. You could hear Speer breathe. He recognized what you should name for the audience without flourish: pace superiority. It was not just that U.S. lines were bigger. It was that the interfaces between steps were smoother, the buffers deeper, the spares bins fatter, and the rail spurs closer. Pace superiority turned the tactical into the inevitable. Once the Americans hit their stride, every day that passed pulled outcomes farther from Germany's reach. The word inevitable belonged in your narrator's mouth exactly once, and this was the place. Aviation arithmetic drove the point home. 96,000 aircraft sliced into categories: heavy bombers, mediums, lights, fighters, trainers, transports. Subtotals became strategy with rivets. What sank in was not grandeur, but variety. Long-range heavies for the strategic war, mediums and light bombers for the tactical fight, fighters by the tens of thousands for escort and control of the vertical, trainers to keep the pipeline full, transports to keep the front fed. This was what it meant to smother the enemy in an avalanche of production. At the table, Nitze slid over another kind of evidence: shipping manifests, supply ledgers, and a report stamped late 1944. It charted how Germany's transport arteries collapsed. Canals blocked, rail hubs shattered, barges stranded. Speer had written memoranda warning about those very vulnerabilities. Now he saw them returned to him as proof. The factory could be ready, the parts perfect. But if the trains died, the line starved. This was where the hook from your title fit. Speer did not physically pace American assembly lines during the war. He walked them through film, photos, and charts that left no room for illusions. The decisive moment was not a tour, but a briefing. The war's last verdicts were not shouted. They were summarized. The projector went dark. The fan kept whirring. A paperclip slid. Small sounds gave the scene its weight. Speer would later publish memoirs. Smooth prose, sobering confessions, strategic omissions, and controversy would swirl around the image of a penitent technocrat. But the simpler truth remained. When presented with the lines that fed the sky in 1944, he understood the arithmetic. And arithmetic, in that room, felt like judgment. At Willow Run, they said, a Liberator left the line roughly once an hour. If you started a stopwatch at midnight, by breakfast the line had birthed half a squadron. By lunch, a squadron and a half. By nightfall, a group. One building, one day. And that was only one plant in an industry that had learned to do what Germany could not: make speed routine. For Speer, that was the walk he never needed to take. The walk was already over by the time the numbers reached his desk. February 1942. Berlin. Snow clung to the rooftops of ministries, and smoke from bombed-out suburbs drifted like a reminder that war was no longer distant. Inside the Reich chancellery, Albert Speer received a promotion that would define his life: Minister of Armaments and War Production. He was 36 years old, an architect with Hitler's trust, suddenly responsible for keeping an empire alive with factories, furnaces, and fear. His title sounded like paper, but his power was steel. When Speer looked at Germany's production tables that winter, he saw chaos disguised as effort. Thousands of workshops duplicated one another's work. Military branches fought like rival companies, each demanding priority, each hoarding supplies. Plants worked at half capacity, while coal sat in the wrong rail yard or ball bearings were locked behind a bottleneck in Schweinfurt. Germany's industrial system was not a machine. It was a collection of quarrels. Speer's first moves were organizational, not technical. He created committees, forced firms to share tooling, bullied aircraft designers into trimming overlapping projects. To the German public, he sold it as efficiency. To Hitler, he sold it as miracles. And for a while, the numbers seemed to support him. Between 1942 and 1944, production of aircraft and tanks did climb. Germany built more fighters in 1944 than in any year before. The propaganda line was that Speer had bent physics to his will. But physics has a long memory. What Speer did not yet know, or perhaps refused to face, was the scale of the enemy's response. America had entered the war with an industrial base, untouched by bombing and nourished by oceans of raw material. U.S. plants in Detroit, Buffalo, and Seattle were converting at a speed Germany could not comprehend. A car company could stop building sedans on a Friday and roll out bomber subassemblies on Monday. For Germany, retooling took months, often years. The gap was not in genius, it was in rhythm. In spring 1942, Speer toured Germany's aircraft plants. He found men hammering by hand, riveting in narrow sheds, wings hung from rafters like laundry. Each plant looked like a workshop scaled up, never a system scaled out. When he asked about cycle times, the numbers were vague. A fighter might take weeks, a bomber months. Efficiency depended on luck, if coal trains were on time, if ball bearings arrived, if air raids spared the roof. Germany produced weapons the way a craftsman built furniture. America was already learning to treat bombers like automobiles. Speer's diaries later admitted to a creeping unease. In May 1942, he received reports of American shipbuilding in yards along the East Coast. One Liberty ship, they said, had been launched after just 5 days of assembly. The number sounded impossible, almost comic. German naval engineers dismissed it as a publicity stunt. But even at a more modest pace, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, the reality was terrifying. Germany's U-boats could sink freighters faster than Britain could replace them. America was about to flip that equation. The mathematics of mass production was about to sink the mathematics of attrition. By 1943, Speer began speaking of total war production. The phrase sounded defiant. In truth, it was defensive. He stripped luxuries, banned civilian models, diverted aluminum from pots to planes, conscripted labor from occupied countries. At first, it worked. Graphs climbed. Hitler praised his miracle man. But behind the numbers, Speer saw fragility. Coal shortages rippled through every chart. Rail disruptions froze assembly lines. Allied bombers over the Ruhr turned efficient plants into hollow shells. Every raid erased weeks of planning. Then came the Jägerstab in 1944, the fighter staff, a desperate effort to flood the skies with interceptors. It was Speer's most intense experiment in centralization. Engineers and managers slept in offices, production tables hung on walls like sacred texts, and Hitler demanded thousands of fighters per month. For a few months, they succeeded on paper. German output of fighters nearly doubled. But Speer could not ignore the truth. Pilots were dying faster than factories could replace them. America and Britain were producing not just planes, but airmen, fuel, and training hours. Germany was producing empty cockpits. The irony gnawed at him. He had streamlined processes, cut out duplication, bullied industry into cooperation. Yet every gain was tactical, never strategic. It was like patching holes in a ship while the ocean rose around him. In reports to Hitler, he emphasized growth. In private, he began to admit limits. Numbers impressed dictators, but numbers also whispered the truth. Germany could not win a production war against the United States. The moment of recognition came in fragments, not thunderclaps. A report on American aluminum capacity, 10 times Germany's. A statistic on U.S. tire output, enough to keep every convoy rolling with spares. A briefing on training fields in Texas alone, housing more pilots than Germany could graduate in a year. Each number was a blade, slicing through the illusion of parity. Speer wrote later that by 1943 he knew the tide was irreversible. But he kept managing, because management was survival. To his staff, he presented optimism. He spoke of rationalization, of miracle weapons like the jet fighter and V-weapons. He claimed that discipline could bridge the gap. But at night, staring at reports, he confronted a different picture. America's economy was not a rival factory. It was a continent. The rivers, the highways, the railways, the oil fields, the labor pool, all of it functioned as one machine. Germany was only an engine running hot, waiting to seize. Speer tried to hide the fear under rhetoric. In speeches, he compared German workers to knights at the forge, hammering against impossible odds. But even knights tire. By late 1944, production tables showed the truth starkly. Germany produced more aircraft than ever before, yet the Luftwaffe lost control of its own skies. Factories still turned out tanks, but without fuel, they were iron statues. The miracle had turned into a mirage. The knowledge weighed on him like lead. Every day he walked through plants, hearing the clang of steel and the hiss of welds. He also heard the echo of distant factories in Detroit and Chicago, humming with a steadier rhythm. He could not see them, but he imagined their endless lines. He felt like an architect sketching a modest house while staring at blueprints for a skyscraper. Comparison itself was defeat. By the end of 1944, Speer was no longer asking whether Germany could outproduce America. He was asking how long he could disguise the inevitable. Hitler demanded miracles. Speer provided graphs, but he knew graphs could not win. Numbers had become his prison. For the viewer, the lesson is clear. Speer knew early, but he kept building. He knew by 1943, but he kept promising. He knew by 1944, but he kept lying to himself and to Hitler. He knew, yet he could not stop. Knowledge without power is torment. The camera opens on Willow Run, Michigan. A building so vast it seemed less a factory than a horizon under a roof. Workers joked that you could ride a bicycle from one end to the other and arrive late for lunch. From the air, it looked like a steel city sprawled across farmland. Windows glinting like frozen rivers, ventilation towers puffing steam into the cold air. Inside, the hum never stopped. Shifts overlapped, whistles blew, and the line crawled forward like an endless serpent of aluminum and rivets. The first impression was not speed, but scale. Fuselages rested on jigs as high as houses. Wing spars stretched longer than city buses. Racks of rivet guns hung like instruments in an orchestra, each one tuned to a specific note in the score of production. Men and women in coveralls stood shoulder to shoulder, tightening bolts, welding seams, inspecting joints. The rhythm was relentless, but strangely calm. A bomber was not born in a rush. It was born in a steady heartbeat. Compare this to Germany, where aircraft were built in workshops scattered across forests and mountains. A fuselage might be hauled by cart, a wing smuggled through a tunnel, an engine finished in a garage-turned-shop. There was craft, yes, but there was no rhythm. Every raid interrupted the fragile chain. Every relocation demanded weeks of improvisation. What Germany gained in secrecy, it lost in tempo. America built under daylight, Germany hid in darkness. At Willow Run, the math was visible to the naked eye. Workers said the line was so efficient that a B-24 left the plant roughly every hour. Break it down. One plane an hour meant 24 a day. By the end of a week, a small air force. A single building outproduced entire German sectors. The numbers felt unreal until you saw the crates of parts stacked like city blocks, the forklifts darting between aisles, the trains waiting on spurs to carry finished bombers into the world. Women were part of this miracle. They tied back their hair, pulled on gloves, and took stations once reserved for men. Riveting, welding, soldering, they mastered it all. A supervisor once said he could tell which crews were led by women. Their seams were straighter, their parts meticulously aligned. For many of them, the factory was both battlefield and emancipation. They were not fighting with rifles, but with torque wrenches. Each rivet was a bullet, each shift a campaign. The sound of the line was its own kind of music. Rivet guns hammered in staccato bursts. Overhead cranes groaned as they lifted engines into place. Radios crackled swing tunes, faint under the roar of machinery. The air smelled of hot oil, cutting fluid, and ozone from welders' arcs. To step onto the floor was to step into a symphony of industry. It was not glamorous, it was grinding, but it was unstoppable. By 1944, the United States had dozens of such plants. Detroit, Fort Worth, Seattle. Each was a node in a larger network. Railroads fed them coal and steel. Rivers carried ore to furnaces. Highways brought workers by the tens of thousands. The war economy functioned like a single organism, blood pumping through arteries of transport. Germany, by contrast, was increasingly anemic. Every bridge blown, every canal cut, every yard bombed was another artery severed. The workers themselves understood the stakes. Many wrote letters saying, "We are fighting here as much as over there." A riveter in Michigan compared her shifts to the Battle of the Bulge, long, cold, and relentless, but necessary for victory. A foreman said that watching a plane roll off the line felt like watching a child graduate. It carried a piece of you into the world. Patriotism was measured not in speeches, but in hours punched on a time card. The tempo itself became a weapon. When the Germans spoke of total war, they meant rationing, scarcity, sacrifice. When Americans lived it, they meant acceleration. More shifts, more machines, more training schools. Pilots were waiting for planes, and planes were waiting for pilots. The cycle was seamless. For Germany, pilots died faster than aircraft arrived. For America, pilots sometimes waited in queues for their aircraft. That difference was the war. Albert Speer later admitted the psychological shock of seeing statistics on Willow Run. A single factory outproduced Germany's entire bomber fleet in some months. He had spent years chasing efficiency, bullying managers, dispersing production. And here was proof that an open society with intact resources could simply decide to build faster and then make it so. For him, the realization was like watching a dam burst upstream while you patched leaks downstream. The current was unstoppable. Numbers gain power when you give them form. Imagine a football field. Now imagine a fuselage the length of that field rolling forward inch by inch. Multiply that by dozens of lines, each with thousands of hands. Multiply again by the calendar. Day, night, weekend, holiday. That was America's war machine. It did not sprint, it marched. And marching, in war, wins more than sprinting. For German intelligence officers, glimpses of these plants were nightmares. Photographs showed parking lots filled with cars, suggesting shifts of tens of thousands of workers. Reconnaissance confirmed rail spurs bringing in ore and rolling out bombers. Every image contradicted propaganda. The United States was not weak, not decadent. It was awake, working and endless. Even the architecture reflected confidence. Willow Run was designed by Albert Kahn, an architect who believed in light and air. Skylights flooded the line with daylight. High ceilings vented fumes. Workers could see each other across bays, creating a sense of shared mission. Germany's dispersed shops were caves by comparison. Dark, cramped, suffocating. The contrast was more than physical. It was cultural. One side hid, the other displayed. Shift changes were like tides. A whistle, a rush of footsteps, and the floor never emptied. The line did not sleep because the war did not sleep. America understood that attrition was not won in battles, but in minutes. Each minute saved was another plane, another convoy, another squadron. The workers joked that they could measure victory in coffee cups. Coffee kept them awake, and their wakefulness kept the bombers flowing. For the viewer, this is the heart of the lesson. Industry is strategy. A rivet is as decisive as a bullet, a conveyor as powerful as a tank. Wars are not only fought by soldiers. They are fought by workers who never see the front but change its outcome. The line that never slept was as lethal as any weapon, and Germany, despite every effort, never built one like it. A number on a chart can look sterile. 96,000 aircraft in a year is impressive on paper, but until you see the shadow of wings crossing the sky, it is only ink. The United States made sure that numbers became weight. Weight became formations, and formations became inevitability. By mid-1944, the 8th Air Force could send 1,000 bombers in a single day over Germany. The 9th Air Force, focused on tactical support, filled the skies with medium bombers and fighter bombers. The 15th Air Force out of Italy added its own hammer blows. Speer's graphs back in Berlin could not disguise what his pilots and civilians already knew. The sky was no longer contested. It was occupied. For German civilians, the arithmetic was terrifyingly visible. In 1943, an air raid might bring a few hundred planes. By 1944, the sky turned black. Entire squadrons crossed in precise formation, contrails twisting into braids, the sound of engines a rolling thunder that shook windows for miles. Each bomber carried 2 or 3 tons of explosives. Multiply 1,000 by 2 tons, then again by the number of raids per week. That was what 96,000 aircraft a year meant in practice. Fighter escorts turned the knife. In 1943, bombers often flew unprotected deep into Germany, suffering catastrophic losses. But by early 1944, P-51 Mustangs began to appear over Berlin itself. They had the range to escort bombers all the way, the speed to duel with Messerschmitts, the firepower to shred them. For German pilots, it was like fighting a flood with buckets. They might down a bomber, but 2 Mustangs were waiting. The attrition graph bent sharply downward. Consider the survival odds. In 1940, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot might have had months of operational life. By 1944, it could be measured in days. Training schools churned out boys barely 20, many with only a few dozen hours in the cockpit. They faced squadrons of Americans with hundreds of hours of flight time, flying newer machines with fresh replacements arriving constantly. The mathematics of survival had collapsed. On the ground, the same numbers dictated outcomes. At Normandy, the German army expected to contest the beaches with artillery and armor. But American fighters prowled overhead, strafing convoys, destroying bridges, isolating units. Pilots described it as flying artillery. Infantrymen later recalled that every time they saw a column of German vehicles, within hours a squadron of fighter bombers reduced it to smoking wreckage. Industrial output had become battlefield certainty. Speer himself noted that every German counteroffensive was paralyzed by lack of fuel and fear of airstrikes. Even when tanks rolled, they could not move freely by day. Bridges were bombed faster than engineers could repair them. Supply lines dissolved into ditches. He admitted privately that the greatest enemy of German industry was not the bombs that fell on factories, but the ones that fell on transport arteries. Bomb craters became bigger obstacles than generals. The psychological effect was just as devastating. Civilians wrote in diaries about the sky rumbling with engines day after day, a noise that never ceased. Children sketched airplanes in notebooks instead of flowers. Women learned to recognize the shapes of B-17s and B-24s the way earlier generations had recognized birds. Numbers became a culture of fear. When the Allies flew over in such mass, it was not only an attack, it was a message. Resistance was futile. Inside the Luftwaffe, despair spread. Commanders reported that new pilots were being sacrificed pointlessly. One veteran said, "We were throwing eggs at a stone wall." Even Göring, once boastful about the invincibility of the Luftwaffe, could not deny reality. The wall of American industry had produced a wall of aircraft, and no bravery could breach it. Even small details betrayed the imbalance. American crews rotated home after a set number of missions. German pilots flew until they died. American squadrons received replacement aircraft within weeks. German squadrons cannibalized wrecks for spare parts. American bombers carried radar, advanced sights, and redundant systems. German planes carried the scars of rushed assembly and shortages of materials. Quality followed quantity. For the U.S., losses were tragic but tolerable. Losing 50 bombers in a raid was painful, but by the following week, replacements filled the gaps. For Germany, losing 50 aircraft might cripple an entire sector for a month. Attrition worked like compound interest. The longer the war dragged, the more insurmountable the gap became. Speer realized that by 1944, the war was mathematically unwinnable. He admitted later that the war economy had become an exercise in delay, not victory. His task was to stretch resources, to promise miracles, to hope for political fractures among the Allies. But when he looked at the output tables from America, he knew. Industry had written the ending. To explain it to the audience, frame it in human terms. Imagine a young German recruit climbing into his first fighter. He knows his squadron has 12 planes. Across the channel, an American base has hundreds. Even if he wins today, tomorrow more will come. That knowledge erodes courage faster than bullets. Wars are lost in the mind before they are lost in the field. Numbers do not just supply war, they shape morale. 1,000 planes overhead was not only destructive, it was a sermon. It preached inevitability. For every German soldier on the ground, for every civilian in a shelter, for Speer himself reading reports in Berlin, the numbers were no longer abstract. They were doom in formation. Railways are the bloodstream of an industrial nation. Cut the veins and the muscles weaken. By 1944, American and British air planners understood this with clinical precision. They turned their bombers not only on factories, but on the arteries that fed them. The rail yards, bridges, fuel depots, and canals that kept Germany moving. Speer watched in frustration as the Reich's carefully balanced system collapsed. He had managed, even under bombardment, to disperse aircraft plants, move production underground, and shift labor around the Reich. But without transport, all those measures were meaningless. You can build a Messerschmitt in a mountain cave, but if you cannot fuel it or move it to the front, it is a coffin with wings. Rail yards in Cologne, Leipzig, and Hamm became craters visible from the sky. The Allies used a new tactic called transportation plan. Instead of scattering bombs across cities, they concentrated on bottlenecks. A single destroyed bridge could paralyze an entire region. A burned-out locomotive meant dozens of idle trains. The mathematics was elegant. One bomber could silence a factory by destroying the track that carried its coal. Civilians noticed it first in empty shelves. Diaries from 1944 speak of trains arriving hours late, or not at all. Milk soured in warm wagons. Coal never reached power plants. Grain rotted in sidings. Even German propaganda could not disguise the shortages. The Reich had boasted of endurance, but endurance cannot move without wheels. On the front lines, soldiers felt it in their stomachs. Tank units received half rations of fuel. Ammunition deliveries became erratic. Commanders begged for replacements that never came. One officer wrote, "Our enemy is not only the Americans with their bombers, but the silence of our rails." Silence where there should have been whistles and the clatter of steel was more terrifying than the bombs themselves. Airmen described the sight from above as almost surgical. Squadrons of B-26 Marauders struck marshalling yards at dawn, the bombs cascading in precise rows. Photographs afterward showed hundreds of rail cars overturned like toys. Smoke columns pointed the way for afternoon raids by B-17s. By night, mosquitoes dropped flares to guide pathfinders. Round the clock, the arteries bled. The consequences multiplied like a contagion. A destroyed bridge meant traffic rerouted to another line. That line, already overstretched, collapsed under the weight. Every hour of delay rippled outward. A factory in Saxony might still be intact, but if its bearings could not reach Munich, and if its output could not reach the Luftwaffe depots, it was dead weight. Speer tried emergency measures. He ordered thousands of forced laborers to repair rails under fire. Men in striped uniforms worked by lantern light, dragging rails back into place, only to see them destroyed again by the next raid. Bridges were rebuilt with timber, then reduced to splinters. Every bridge became a target. Every night, one survivor recalled. Fuel became the breaking point. In May 1944, raids on synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Pulitz began a new chapter. Speer called fuel the lifeblood of war, and the Allies drained it dry. Aircraft sat idle on runways, tanks hidden in barns. Generals complained that offensives were canceled, not for lack of courage, but for lack of gasoline. One Panzer division received only enough fuel to move a few miles a day. It was a lion chained by thirst. For civilians, the collapse of transport felt like suffocation. Cities accustomed to coal heat now froze. Families broke furniture to burn for warmth. Electricity blackouts spread. Even hospitals rationed light. People whispered that the war was already lost, not because the Allies stood on German soil, but because the trains had stopped singing. Propaganda tried to shift blame. Goebbels spoke of sabotage, of betrayal, of fate. But the people knew the truth. They could see the empty tracks. They could smell the uncollected garbage, the unbaked bread. Numbers on Speer's charts meant nothing compared to the empty larders of Berlin and Hamburg. American airmen knew what they were doing. They spoke of cutting Germany's nervous system. One pilot described hitting a rail hub as like pulling the plug on a machine. Without transport, the machine sputtered. Without fuel, the machine died. Even the Wehrmacht, once proud of its efficiency, admitted defeat by logistics. A report from autumn 1944 concluded, "The enemy has struck not only at our armies, but at our ability to be an army." That sentence carried more weight than any battlefield defeat. A soldier without supplies, a man with a rifle, and no bullets. Speer's own words after the war carried the same message. He confessed that by late 1944, the collapse of transport made production figures irrelevant. "We built weapons faster than ever," he said. But they were weapons without battlefields. The arteries had been severed. The body of the Reich still twitched, but it was already dead. Every war is a contest of destruction. But in 1944, the destruction of German rails and fuel was not just physical, it was symbolic. Civilians understood that trains symbolized order, continuity, daily life. Their absence meant chaos. Their silence was louder than bombs. When the arteries broke, the will to fight bled out with them. That is why Speer walked the American assembly lines with such awe. He knew the truth. You can only win wars if your numbers reach the front. America's bombers not only built numbers, they destroyed the opponents. The contrast was brutal. It was not just that the Allies had more, it was that Germany had less every day, less with every bridge collapsed, less with every tank stranded for lack of fuel. Numbers became emptiness, emptiness became surrender. By late summer 1944, the European sky had changed. Where once German fighters ruled in disciplined swarms, now the horizon belonged to the Allies. Steel filled the air, bombers in endless streams, fighters sweeping ahead like wolves guarding a flock. To soldiers on the ground, the sound was constant thunder. To Speer, it was mathematics taking physical form. Every new Mustang, every fresh fortress, was another line in an equation Germany could no longer solve. Pilots on both sides felt it first in their bones. For the Americans, missions, once suicidal, now felt like statistics working in their favor. A B-17 crewman remembered that in 1943 he counted odds like a gambler, 1 in 3 chance of coming home. By autumn 1944, the odds flipped. Escorts stretched all the way to Berlin. Suddenly, we weren't flying to die, he recalled. We were flying to win. That shift in expectation was revolutionary. For German pilots, the experience inverted. Once lions of the Reich, aces like Galland and Hartmann, suddenly became prey. A Luftwaffe veteran described flying into bomber streams as entering a storm of steel you could not punch through. Guns bristled in every direction, fighters attacked from above, and even survival became unlikely. The arithmetic of the skies was merciless. Each German fighter lost took months to replace. Each American fighter lost was replaced in weeks, sometimes days. Numbers themselves told the story. By mid-1944, American factories produced nearly 100,000 aircraft in a single year. Germany managed fewer than 40,000, and many were grounded for lack of fuel. Even if German pilots flew with unmatched skill, they could not reverse those numbers. It was not courage that failed, it was capacity. Steel and gasoline beat valor. On the ground, civilians stared upward at contrails. Children in Hamburg, Munich, and Dresden learned to read the sky the way farmers once read clouds. A single thin line meant reconnaissance. Dozens meant another raid was coming. The sky itself became a battlefield, visible to everyone. The heavens were scarred every day, one woman wrote, and each scar meant more death below. For her, the front line was no longer hundreds of miles away. It hovered directly above her roof. The Germans still tried to resist with ingenuity. New jet aircraft like the Me-262 promised salvation. Their speed doubled that of Mustangs. Yet jets required perfect runways, huge amounts of fuel, and pilots trained in months rather than years. Allied bombing made all of that almost impossible. Jets became symbols of desperation rather than weapons of victory. They were miracles in theory, a mechanic recalled. But miracles cannot fly on empty tanks. Speer understood this with painful clarity. He visited underground hangars where Messerschmitts gleamed like predatory birds. The sight might have inspired confidence, but he knew each was chained by shortage. Without fuel, a fighter is sculpture. Without spare parts, it is scrap metal. His reports to Hitler carried the truth in numbers. Production rose, but sorties fell. The line of ascent on his graphs bent downward into nothingness. American airmen noticed the shift too. One pilot remembered flying over Cologne and seeing German fighters circle, but never attack. They were ghosts, he said. You could see the fear in their maneuvers. They knew what would happen if they dived. The hunters had become shadows. The battle for the skies was not only physical, it was psychological. A German ace admitted after the war, "We knew the outcome before the fight began. We flew to survive, not to win." On the front lines, soldiers read the air like an omen. Infantry advancing through France cheered when Mustangs strafed ahead, their wings flashing in the sun. One private called them angels with machine guns. For German troops, the same sight froze blood. Tanks hidden in forests dared not move by day. Convoys traveled at night like fugitives. "Even the sky betrayed us," a sergeant muttered, his men staring upward more than forward. The war on the ground slowed, but the war in the air never slept. Around-the-clock bombing became routine. By day, B-24s hammered fuel depots. By night, Lancasters blanketed cities in fire. No German city escaped untouched. The sky became steel, and steel became fire. Speer himself, moving through bombed-out factories, described it as walking through numbers turned to ash. The arithmetic of production ended in ruins. One vivid story carried the truth. In late 1944, a German railway crew tried to move artillery by night. A single P-38 Lightning, guided by radar, found them. It strafed once, twice, and the entire train derailed. Dozens of men scattered, cargo ablaze. Survivors later wrote that it felt like fighting against an omniscient enemy. Technology, not just bravery, was deciding the war. Every comparison showed the same imbalance. American pilots flew hundreds of hours before combat. German replacements sometimes flew less than 20. American factories churned out bombers with radar, radios, and oxygen systems. German factories assembled planes with missing parts, patched with wood and canvas. American airfields stretched across England and France. German fields were craters. The metaphor of steel held true. Steel is hard, unyielding, cold. It bends only when fire and force are applied. In 1944, Allied steel filled the sky, heated by fuel shaped by mass production, sharpened by relentless training. German steel cracked. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, became a shadow of itself. We lost not in courage, Gallant admitted, but in arithmetic. Every war ends when one side can no longer fight the equation. In the skies over Europe, that moment came not with a single battle, but with countless missions, countless bombs, countless contrails. The sky itself became a factory floor where numbers ruled, and Germany, for all its brilliance, could not build enough steel to reclaim it. Autumn 1944. Europe's battlefields were changing shape. Not only cities, but the arteries of Germany's war machine, railways, bridges, depots, were collapsing under relentless bombardment. On paper, Albert Speer still reported increases in tank and plane production. On the ground, however, those weapons often stood silent. They had no fuel to move, no rails to carry them, no skies to shield them. To ordinary German soldiers, the change was unmistakable. In France, a Panzer crew near Metz waited 3 days for gasoline that never came. They spent the time hiding their Tiger under branches, terrified of being spotted from above. When the fuel finally arrived, it was in barrels so small that the tank could only crawl a few kilometers before running dry again. "We became monuments," one gunner later said. Steel statues surrounded by silence. The Allies had discovered the logic of strangulation. Instead of only fighting divisions head-on, they bombed the skeleton of German logistics. Bridges across the Rhine vanished overnight. Marshalling yards once alive with steam locomotives became craters. By September, a single strike on Ham Rail Hub destroyed 1-200 wagons in one raid. Numbers like that told their own story. When the arteries are cut, the heart cannot beat. Speer toured the wreckage himself. In Dusseldorf, he stepped through twisted rails, charred wooden ties, the scorched remains of freight cars. He wrote that production lines still churned tanks, but they had no way to reach the front. "It was as if we were building weapons for ghosts," he remarked in frustration. He knew factories were only half of war. Distribution was the other half. Without one, the other became theater. On the Allied side, infantry felt the results. In the Ardennes, soldiers advancing along muddy roads found German positions eerily undersupplied. One American remembered seizing a forward bunker, stocked with machine guns, but no ammunition. "They had teeth," he said, "but nothing to bite with." The collapse of supply lines meant battles once predicted to last weeks could dissolve in days. Still, the Germans tried to adapt. Horses replaced trucks in many divisions. By 1945, 2/3 of the Wehrmacht's transport relied on animals, not engines. The image of a modern mechanized army dissolved back into the 19th century. "We looked like Napoleon's army," a captain in Hungary observed bitterly. "Only with better rifles." The step backward was visible to every soldier trudging behind carts filled with shells instead of roaring half-tracks. The shortage of fuel was the most dramatic. Entire Luftwaffe squadrons sat idle, their planes gleaming on runways but never taking off. Pilots drilled in cockpits, practicing procedures without burning a drop of gasoline. One recalled climbing into his Me-109 day after day, flipping switches, moving levers, yet never leaving the ground. "We were actors in a play without an audience," he later confessed. For civilians, the collapse meant hunger. Coal trains no longer reached cities in time for winter. Housewives lined up for hours with ration cards, only to find shelves empty. Children scavenged rubble for splinters of wood to burn. Each day, the distant hum of Allied bombers reinforced the futility. We lived by candlelight and fear, one woman wrote in a diary, while the sky reminded us that tomorrow would be worse. Speer continued to argue with Hitler. His memos warned that production without distribution was meaningless. Hitler dismissed him, clinging to fantasies of miracle weapons, jets, rockets, even supposed super tanks that would reverse the tide. Yet Speer had seen the statistics. Every V-2 cost the same as dozens of fighters. Every tank without gasoline was wasted steel. We were mortgaging reality, he later said, to buy illusions. On the front lines, German officers made brutal choices. A battalion commander in the Hürtgen forest ordered his men to abandon heavy weapons because there was no fuel to tow them. They marched on foot, carrying only rifles and grenades. It felt like surrender without the flag, the lieutenant remembered. The enemy was not just the Allies, it was arithmetic. Allied troops saw the change too. After the Normandy breakout, American convoys raced across France with supplies. Jeep columns stretched for miles, Red Ball Express trucks loaded with food, ammo, and gasoline. GIs joked that logistics was their secret weapon. In contrast, German units starved in place. The visual comparison was stark. Allied columns thundered forward. German soldiers scavenged potatoes from fields. Even elite formations were not spared. Waffen SS divisions, once feared, now fought half strength, their armored spearheads reduced to a handful of vehicles. In Lorraine, a commander reported that his division had 12 tanks left, of which only 4 were operational. He begged for reinforcements that never came. His men fought bravely, but bravery cannot fill empty fuel tanks. The collapse of ground transport also crippled Germany's ability to maneuver. Armies that once executed lightning campaigns now stumbled. Speer observed that by late 1944, Germany could no longer shift forces rapidly from one front to another. We had lost mobility, he admitted. An army that cannot move is already defeated. For the Allies, this collapse confirmed strategy. General Eisenhower's staff studied reconnaissance photos of German rail lines and noted entire sectors paralyzed. Reports spoke of locomotives rusting in sidings, coal piles left untouched, entire trains stranded in bomb craters. A war of movement had turned into a war of immobility for Germany, and immobility is death in modern conflict. In villages across occupied Europe, locals saw proof with their own eyes. Convoys of German troops limped through with wagons instead of trucks. Children whispered that the Reich was finished. Farmers who had feared German authority now noticed soldiers begging for bread. Authority dissolves when an army must ask civilians for food. A single Allied bomb could paralyze a region. One strike on a bridge meant weeks of repair. But while Germany scrambled for steel and cement, American engineers built Bailey bridges in hours. The contrast was more than technical. It was cultural. Flexibility versus rigidity, improvisation versus bureaucracy. The faster side owned the battlefield. Even propaganda faltered. Goebbels still preached a final victory, but soldiers carrying rifles on empty stomachs knew better. One conscript scrawled in a letter, "We march, but we march nowhere." His words captured the truth better than any broadcast. Speer himself described the Reich in 1944 as a machine still spinning, but already disconnected from its power source. The cogs turned, but nothing moved forward. By the time winter came, the outcome was clear. Without fuel, without mobility, without supply, an army is a shadow. The collapse on the ground mirrored the collapse in the skies. Together they formed a closing fist. For Germany, every step now was retreat. Every march a delay, every order a postponement of the inevitable. The war had shifted from strategy to arithmetic, and in that arithmetic, Germany had already lost. By the dawn of 1945, the Reich stood on hollow legs, on maps in Hitler's bunker. Colored pins still marked divisions, squadrons, and armies. On the ground, many of those pins represented skeletons. Battalions with a fraction of their men, tanks without fuel, aircraft with no pilots to fly them. Yet inside the crumbling command centers, the talk was of miracle weapons. Rockets that could strike London, jet planes that could tear apart bomber formations, submarines that could starve Britain. The fantasy clung like smoke in the ruins. Albert Speer, more than any other, carried the burden of truth. He still toured factories, still read the ledgers, still counted the steel. His engineers told him the same story. Parts missing, shipments delayed, machines broken beyond repair. In Stuttgart, he walked through a workshop once filled with the clatter of presses. Now only silence, broken by distant bombing, remained. A handful of exhausted workers stood around machinery without electricity. One turned to Speer and muttered, "We build nothing but echoes." Hitler refused to hear it. In December 1944, during the Ardennes offensive, he spoke with blazing eyes of turning the war. He believed the Allies could be split, that America might negotiate, that England might withdraw. For fuel, entire civilian stocks were drained, leaving towns without heating. Children froze while tanks rolled briefly forward. But the offensive collapsed, leaving only graves and shattered hopes. Speer knew the truth. Germany had spent its last reserves chasing a ghost. Ordinary soldiers sensed the illusion too. A private retreating from Belgium recalled an officer telling them to hold fast because jets would soon sweep the skies. He looked up and saw only contrails of Allied bombers. "We waited for thunder," he said. But only silence came. His words captured the widening gulf between propaganda and reality. The V-2 rockets became the centerpiece of Hitler's vision. They struck London and Antwerp with terrifying force, but strategically they were futile. Each rocket consumed vast resources. For the price of one V-2, dozens of fighters could have been built. Speer knew the arithmetic. He watched as Hitler celebrated rocket tests while factories starved for coal. "We traded fleets of aircraft for falling fire," Speer later admitted. The rockets terrorized but did not change the war. Even the jets, the Me-262s, came too late. Pilots marveled at their speed, but they lacked numbers, fuel, and training. Allied pilots adapted quickly, striking during takeoff and landing. A veteran recalled watching a Me-262 roar past at twice his speed, only to see it destroyed moments later as it tried to land. "They were arrows without bows," he said. "Weapons without context, brilliance without weight." Meanwhile, civilians bore the collapse. In Berlin, women stood in endless queues, their breath fogging in the winter air, waiting for bread that never arrived. In Hamburg, children picked through rubble for coal dust to heat a pot of thin soup. Rumors of miracle weapons meant little to empty stomachs. "We believed nothing," one mother recalled. "Only hunger was real." Speer tried once more to tell Hitler the truth. In February 1945, he presented charts showing fuel at 3% of 1943 levels. Aircraft production fell not from lack of effort, but because aluminum could not reach factories. Trains stood silent for want of coal. He explained that no amount of rockets or jets could alter this arithmetic. Hitler exploded in fury, denouncing his minister as defeatist. Yet behind his anger was fear. The leader who once commanded millions now shouted into an echo chamber. On the front lines, the collapse became grotesque. Teenagers of the Hitler Youth marched with Panzerfausts against tanks. Old men of the Volkssturm drilled with antique rifles. A general later wrote, "It was an army in name only." Against them stood Allied armies supplied with endless convoys, skies filled with cover, artillery firing without pause. The contrast was unbearable. Courage became sacrifice. Sacrifice became waste. Speer's own loyalty fractured. He began to think not of winning, but of saving what little could be saved. Bridges, factories, lives. He secretly issued orders to halt the scorched earth policy Hitler demanded, trying to preserve infrastructure for a Germany that might survive after the war. "We could not destroy the future to prolong the past," he said. His defiance was quiet, almost invisible, but it marked the beginning of realism inside a world still drunk on fantasy. Individual stories revealed the human cost of illusion. In East Prussia, a family waited for miracle weapons while Soviet tanks rolled into their town. In the Ruhr, miners were told they labored for victory while bombs buried their shafts. A soldier in Hungary wrote that his unit was promised jet support that never arrived. "We lived on promises," he said, "and died on reality." Even Allied observers recognized the charade. American officers interrogating prisoners heard repeated references to rockets, jets, submarines. They realized German propaganda had reached even the front lines. But the prisoners' eyes betrayed the truth. They were exhausted, broken, no longer believers. One American officer remarked, "They still speak of wonder weapons, but they surrender like men who know the war is already gone." The metaphor of illusion ran through everything. Germany had become a house of mirrors, reflecting power it no longer possessed. Rockets lit the sky but did not feed armies. Jets roared but could not multiply. Propaganda screamed but could not fill stomachs. Steel had turned to shadow. Numbers had turned to lies. Speer walked through Berlin in March 1945 and saw ruins lit by fire. He knew that no assembly line, no equation, no miracle could change what was coming. The Reich, built on calculation and discipline, was dissolving in fantasy. He later admitted, "We were engineers building castles in smoke." The collapse of illusions carried its own brutality. Because Hitler clung to them, the war lasted longer, costing hundreds of thousands more lives. The gap between reality and belief was measured in corpses. Soldiers fought battles already lost. Civilians endured bombings already meaningless. It was tragedy, multiplied by stubbornness. In the end, illusions shatter. By April, Allied troops crossed the Rhine, Soviet armies stormed Berlin, and the thousand-year Reich ended in a matter of weeks. Speer stood in the ruins, knowing the truth he had long seen. Numbers do not lie. Production without fuel is waste. Weapons without strategy are decoration. Illusions without power are smoke. And yet the illusions lingered, even as the Reich collapsed into ash. That is the final cruelty of war, not just destruction, but the dreams that sustain it long after reality has spoken. May 1945. Silence fell over Europe, broken only by the rumble of Allied convoys and the hushed voices of civilians picking their way through ruins. For Albert Speer, the silence was louder than bombs. The Reich he had served with numbers and charts was finished. What remained was rubble, hunger, and a reckoning with truth. The Allies wanted to understand how Germany had kept fighting so long. When Speer was captured, interrogators did not only ask about Hitler, or battles, or propaganda. They wanted numbers. How many tanks? How many planes? How much steel and oil? To them, Speer was not just a minister. He was the custodian of Germany's arithmetic. And in those numbers lay the story of defeat. American officers spread his charts across tables in Luxembourg. Columns of production figures still looked impressive: tanks, aircraft, guns. Yet alongside them, supply data revealed collapse. Fuel nearly gone, transport strangled, manpower exhausted. One officer remarked, "It is like looking at a giant with no blood." The body existed, but the lifeblood was drained. Speer admitted it plainly. Factories kept producing into 1945, sometimes at record levels. But weapons left warehouses without fuel to move them, or crews to operate them. He described Panzer divisions with machines but no gasoline, Luftwaffe fields with planes but no pilots. "We produced for emptiness," he told his captors. That single phrase became a summary of the Reich's final years. On the Allied side, analysts compared these admissions with their own data. They realized their bombing campaign had worked not only through destruction, but through paralysis. Rail yards reduced output by half. Synthetic oil plants, once Germany's pride, were rubble. Even when factories stood intact, their networks of coal and steel were broken. A war machine without arteries was a corpse. In Nuremberg, Speer faced public judgment. Unlike many defendants, he admitted guilt, not for ideology, but for enabling a system of war beyond reason. He spoke of illusions, of feeding Hitler's fantasies. "I built weapons for a future that never came," he said to the tribunal. Some called it honesty, others a calculated strategy for survival. Regardless, his words revealed the truth. Germany's defeat was written in numbers long before the final shot. Ordinary Germans began to see it too. A former soldier remembered standing beside rusting tanks in Austria, abandoned for lack of fuel. It was not courage that failed us, he said, but gasoline. Another, captured in the Ruhr, told interrogators, we had rifles, but no bullets, trucks, but no wheels. We were hollow men. Their voices echoed Speer's arithmetic in human form. For Allied strategists, the reckoning was both sobering and instructive. They realized victory had not been inevitable. Without America's factories, without convoys that never ceased, without the arithmetic of abundance, courage alone might not have sufficed. Generals spoke of soldiers' bravery, but in private they studied charts. Charts told them why divisions advanced or starved, why skies cleared or darkened. War, they learned, is fought with will, but won with supply. Speer's reckoning was personal too. In prison, he wrote of walking through the ruins of Berlin and feeling a strange relief. The numbers no longer pressed upon me, he confessed. The burden of charts and graphs had fallen away, leaving only the stark simplicity of defeat. His guilt lay not only in enabling war, but in enabling illusions when he knew the numbers told another story. One story from a soldier crystallized it. A young officer recalled that in January 1945, his company was told jets would soon arrive to save them. They waited, freezing in trenches, staring at empty skies. Weeks later, they surrendered. We realized then, he said, that numbers win wars, not promises. The truth had been whispered by their empty fuel cans, their broken rifles, their silent radios. The Allies also reckoned with their own losses. Thousands of bombers never returned. Convoys lay at the bottom of the Atlantic. Cemeteries spread across continents. Yet when they looked at Speer's charts, they saw the proof. Those sacrifices had starved the German machine until it could only stumble. Arithmetic, cruel and impartial, had favored them in the end. In time, historians would call it the war of production. Tanks, ships, planes, bullets, all measured in millions. But behind those millions were individuals. Workers welding steel in Detroit, women riveting planes in Seattle, convoys braving U-boats in icy waters. Each figure on Speer's charts represented human labor. The reckoning was not only about Germany's collapse, but about the weight of effort on the Allied side. Speer himself coined a bitter phrase, "We were defeated by arithmetic." Yet it was not only arithmetic, it was the will to turn numbers into reality, to turn steel into mobility, to turn fuel into movement. Germany had brilliance, ingenuity, even desperation. But against overwhelming production, brilliance became futile. Against endless convoys, ingenuity became a spark in the storm. The reckoning after war is always twofold: numbers and memory. Numbers explain why victory happened. Memory explains what it cost. Together, they form the final account. For Germany, that account was ruin. For the Allies, it was triumph mixed with grief. For Speer, it was a life spent building illusions out of steel, only to watch them dissolve in fire and dust. In the ruins of Berlin, amid shattered stone and empty streets, the truth stood bare. Weapons can be forged, armies trained, strategies planned. But if supply fails, if arithmetic turns against you, even the most fearsome empire collapses. Numbers, impartial and relentless, are the final judge, and so the reckoning closed. The Reich ended not with miracle weapons, but with silence. The silence of factories without power, tanks without fuel, skies without defenders. In that silence lay the verdict. Germany was finished because the numbers had spoken.